understanding of public policy issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. We welcome women, men, and students as active members. Before I introduce Ingrid Reed, I'd like to thank our member, Marcia Steinberg, who chairs our new Civics Education Committee. And this group has been instrumental in conceiving and organizing tonight's program. So thank you, Civics Education Committee. So Ingrid Reed, Ingrid and her late husband, Marvin Reed, have spent many decades serving New Jersey and the greater Princeton region. For almost 15 years, from the mid-90s to 2010, Ingrid Reed directed the New Jersey Project at Rutgers University's Eagleton Institute of Politics, an organization that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. At Eagleton, Ingrid also chaired the Governor's Task Force on Local Government Ethics. She has served on the boards of the League of Women Voters and the Princeton Adult School, and she was a founding member of the Princeton Area Community Foundation's Fund for Women and Girls. She is a founder of the online news source, New Jersey Spotlight, and serves as a board member at Woman Space. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Ingrid Reed. She's going to be addressing questions we received beforehand, but if you have a question you would like to put in the chat, Ingrid will endeavor to add some towards the end. We expect to go about an hour this evening. So thank you so very much for being here, and thank you, Ingrid, for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's really wonderful to get the questions and know that people are interested. And the title really reflects what I believe. I do very much want to know what voters, what citizens want to know, and then I will try not to be too pushy about what I think they need to know. But it's been great to see the variety of questions that have come in that I was received in advance. There are about 12 of them, and they're a nice combination of questions about how I fit. There are a number of questions that have I in it. So there are people there who really are committed. They're not saying you or them. And then there are some specific information type questions that I'm going to try to get to about the budget, where our money comes from and where it goes, our taxes, and something on redistricting that is a big national issue, as well as an important one here in New Jersey, and a couple of other process issues of how do we make government work. So I'm going to jump in and say that one of the most interesting questions I've ever had came up in the ones that were submitted and made me really think about what is the answer. So that question is, let me quote it. What is the value of my vote? And I thought you could be flippant about it and say the cost of a turkey in Hudson County in 1920. But I don't think that that's what the person meant, but I don't quite know what the person meant. But it really takes us back to what is this all about? And it's all about the first article in the first section of the United States Constitution, because that is the section where the writers, the originators, and so on, figured out how people would be involved in our government. And there was a big controversy because the states had been really playing the role of organizing what little the federal government did and acted on behalf of the people. And it was New Jersey who raised the question of, together with Madison and the discussion in the Federalist Papers, well, what about the people? They're supposed to be in charge. This is we the people. How do we do that? We think that there should be one body and it should be elected by the people. And that would be organized at every state. Well, there were the larger county states that thought that the states should have more prominence, not give that up. So there was a great compromise, and New Jersey had to compromise after the votes weren't there, so that one house is based on the number of people and every person having a vote, while that body would elect the Senate. So that's right there in the first article of the Constitution. So basically, we're a republic, and that means that we select who we want to represent us in making our government work. So I've come to the conclusion that maybe one of the answers to what is the value of my vote is that it's everything. It's priceless, because if we didn't have every person voting, and of course, when the Constitution was first adopted, you know that wasn't really the case, and we've had to make changes in that. But basically, we wouldn't be a country, a democracy, if we didn't value every single citizen participating in government. And if you didn't value voting, what if all of us didn't value voting? We really wouldn't have a government. So I think that at the bottom of it, or at the top of it, what the answer really is that each one of us is valued. Now, there's a lot that can go into that. The turkey isn't the only way that people still get some special attention based on resources, but we're always working on perfecting that. So I'd like you all to think about that. What is the value of your vote? And I suspect that the people who have joined in this discussion do value your vote, and you value the government that is created because we do vote and select our representatives. So that sort of takes us to the question of how do I know what government does, and how do I get informed? And I'd like to go back to that at the very end, but let's look a little bit at the question about if I'm concerned. Again, here's an I question. A person is really invested, concerned about at what is the appropriate level of government to go about to pursue that issue. And with that thought in mind, you realize that, of course, New Jersey government, all governments are really complicated. It's not as easy as having one body represent same numbers. That same little paragraph is where in the Constitution is where it says that there shall be a census, and we shall determine the number every 10 years on which the districts will be established from which people will vote. So it's all right there in the beginning. So I'm going to be referring to different levels of government, but I would like to share something with you. And if the people who have my little diagrams that I prepared could put up the getting involved in New Jersey politics and government. This is a not a back of the envelope, but no, not that. That's the budget. We're going to get to that. The other one. There we go. Okay. You probably won't be able to read this well, but you get the picture, because when I was working with the Center for the American Woman and Politics at Eagleton, they were starting a program that's now very popular called Ready to Run, for people who wanted to be more engaged, more informed about how to run for office. And that's one of the questions that was submitted. How do I get involved in running for office? Well, we found that there were people coming who were very determined, already had a campaign ready and knew what office they wanted to run for. But there were a whole group of people who were interested. And to answer one of the other questions of why run for office, what makes people do that, really didn't have a very good idea of how to get involved, and even where they should seek public office. So this little chart was done on the back of a napkin, not on the back of an envelope. And what it does is try to help people understand that there are government parts to this: local government, county government, school boards, all the levels that you talked about, the legislature, 2 houses of the legislature, the governor. This chart doesn't show the lieutenant governor, which she was not around at the time we put this together. And then you go on up to the federal government, and I didn't really fill that in detail. But you'll see that there's a black column on the other side. And what that says is all the ways that if you want to be engaged and are considering influencing or participating or thinking of running for, how do you get into the mix? How can you show that you are serious about running, that you have something to contribute, that you can meet the people who are running so that you can have a connection with them, so that as we think about government and our involvement, it's a human enterprise. It's very much, do I know somebody? Can I approach them? And believe me, elected officials want to be approached. And if they don't want to be approached, they will learn very quickly that it's important to be approachable. So on the one side, you have government. On the other side, you have what Madison and the Carteret, not Carteret, oh, now I've forgotten his name. He was became the mayor of Paterson and then the governor of New Jersey, that really fought out this issue of how we would have representation. They did not have parties at that time, but we do. And parties are very much a part of our governance, because in New Jersey, what parties do is actually covered by law. There are procedures that parties must follow. That all of the dates that we have for when candidates must submit their petitions if they want to run. Most of government has a party combination, including the fact that we all know that whoever has the most seats in the legislature is in a powerful role to set the agenda and decide what committees people are on. And so you have to be aware of the role of parties in our government. So if you look at the chart, you will see that there's a direct connection between the parties, which are in blue, and so if you're running for the legislature, the party will be playing a role in vetting people to run in the primary according to rules of endorsement. And parties are organized and remain connected with the people who are elected to the legislature. So in terms of this human endeavorment, you really have to have an understanding of who's a party, a responsible party person, which is a responsible role. If we didn't have parties, how would we organize ourselves around some kind of an agenda? And if you ask people, how are you going to vote? One of the very important things that they should consider is what party has an agenda that matches your agenda. But in New Jersey, much of what a party does is connected with, it is covered by law. And if you could see the small type in the black part of how you can be involved, an important part there is whether you're helping people get elected, working for them, and funding them. Because we have a problem in our country, as you well know, about influential corporate and individual very high levels of donations for individuals, that it's very important for people of simple means, but committed to a party, to help raise money and to give money, because otherwise we couldn't have a party structure in the way that it is influenced by many people. And you will recall that in the 2016 election, it was very clear, and it has been more clear, that we even have an influence in party politics and therefore government by people who are giving $5 or $10. And we are seeing some of that same thing happening right now. But it's very important as you think about what government is to realize that informal kind of activity that supports people who are in government, that gives you a chance to serve in a committee if you volunteer, and that giving money is a way of getting involved, which was one of the questions. In fact, I recall in presenting this, a woman stood up and I think was quite upset about this. And she said, well, I don't think government wants me to be involved. This was local government. And she said, I'm a physician in pediatrics. I think I would be a terrific member of the local health commission. And so I sent in my resume and I said I wanted to be appointed. And there were people in the room who sort of looked at her. I sort of looked at her and I said, you know, that is really terrific. But if you got a letter from somebody who wanted you to employ them and just sent you a letter and say, I want to be on your staff, you would certainly take another look at it. But it would not really result in that person getting a job or getting on your team without you having some connection with that person and understanding who that person is, what the values are. And it's the same thing with local government and even with state government, where there are hundreds of commissions for people to be engaged in. But this is a human business, so that if you want to be involved, you have to figure out a way to break through that and get known and in effect show that you are seriously involved. So we use this, but I think if you think of the next questions about how I influence an issue, which we can get to, or how I can find out what level of government to go to solve an issue or a problem, you are basically asking, how can I get credibility both for myself and for the issue? And so I hope that this kind of chart is helpful to you in thinking about how that gets done. At the very local level, you'll see on the bottom blue column is the local committee man or woman. And in Lawrence, I suspect that maybe in every voting district, those positions are filled. But that's really the beginning of democracy here. That's where the first place where you can get elected, and in the very easy, simple way of saying, I would like to run for office. Now, very often those positions are filled by the party leaders, but very often they're open. And also, if they are filled by the party leader, it's a place where if you want to be elected, if you want to have the experience of campaigning, it's a very open process, but it is part of our representative system, which now includes parties as well as the other offices. You will see on the chart, there's no arrow going from school board to party structure, because in New Jersey, people run for school board without a party affiliation. But also in New Jersey, at the municipal level, talking about information, it's very difficult to find on a municipal website the party affiliation of the people who serve us who are elected to serve us at the local level. And some towns, mainly large cities, have nonpartisan elections. And then I think West Windsor also has nonpartisan. That's not a city actually, but the party identity, it seems, very often gets known even though you're not running on a party label. So this little chart will help you see the connection. The other thing that people very often don't realize is that there's no connection on the government side. If you are a member of a local commission, you have no connection at all necessarily to the legislature, and you don't have any standing to go into the legislature. But the party is a stepped process. If you are elected at the local level at your voting district to be the municipal committee man or woman, you automatically serve on the county committee and have a chance to, and are expected to have a chance to vote on the endorsing of the candidates. And that even goes up to the state level. And then at the state level, there's a state committee that then plays a role in the federal government. So that's sort of the structure. And I can't emphasize more clearly that it's important to know the people who you want to go to, if not by name, by position. And we'll come back to that with the how do you influence an issue. The other question that I thought was interesting is what makes people think about running for office? What do you have to do to run for office? Well, basically, what you have to do is put up your hand and say, I want to run for office, if that's what you want. Very often people expect to be asked to run for office if you've been on the lower level of the chart at the town council. If no one has stepped up and is acceptable, which is another piece of this, they might be sought out. And when I was at Eagleton and we talked about how women first got involved when there weren't very many women running for office, the sort of shorthand way of talking about it was that women ran for office to solve a problem. Governor Madeline Kunin in Vermont would often start a conversation about how she got to be governor. And she said, I never thought about being governor, except that my children had to walk to school and cross a street where there wasn't a street light. And I decided that I had to do something about that. And once I started doing something about that, I learned a lot about government and how to get that street light and who I needed to talk to. And it was local level and it was the Department of Transportation. And I began to get a little insight into what was going on, but I still never thought that I wanted to run for governor. But finally, somebody else had seen that I was successful. I got the light. I knew a lot of people. They started asking me how to solve other problems. And then finally somebody said, why don't you run for the legislature? And I thought it over and I think I can do that. So that's the way the story went, that women got into office because they first identified a problem to solve and figured out that they had visibility and they had confidence. While on the other hand, the legend was that men dressed in their suits would look at themselves in the mirror in the morning and know about the legislature and say, I think I can do that. I know who to call, and never really asked themselves, what problem should I solve, and went through that whole process. I think that that's not necessarily true today anymore, as we look at the number of women who have already achieved a position and have said to themselves, I could do that. And I'm sure that there are men who first solved a problem and then realized that, yes, they wanted to be there solving more problems. But in both cases, as you can see, it started out with, who am I and what can I do? And then you had to be engaged with others. It's very rare that anybody can have a even close to successful opportunity to run for office without having both the I part and looking at the chart, be somewhere involved in the plat type and do something that gets you experience, visibility, confidence, and a sense of how you would go about getting elected. In New Jersey, it certainly does help at the legislative level for the party to have noticed you. But at the local level, it very often is what you do volunteering for other kinds of organizations and getting known that makes for a successful run. And then out of that, you find another level. When we did this with the Ready to Run elected people who had already had a successful election, we asked them to identify on this chart, where did they start with their journey into public service. And it was very interesting that some started at the county level, serving on the Commission on Women because they knew a freeholder, while others started at the local level. Others ran for like for a party office, simply by saying that I've already been active, I think I can do this. There's no special place to start. It doesn't mean that if you can start at the school board level and then find out that you really want to be in the legislature, or to be a county freeholder, now known as county commissioner. So the whole question of how do I get started is one of doing some version of Madeline Kunin, is that I want to solve a problem. I want to be part of that, but then to find the persons who can help you and can understand that you have something to contribute. I would say that the question that was raised here is, what are the different ways that people can affect legislation in the New Jersey legislature? Is a really good question, but it's a really hard question to answer, because to affect something in the legislature is probably to, again, go through the I and then the group. You know what you want to solve, what problem you want to solve, or what you want to identify as a problem. But it's highly unlikely that you going alone to visit a legislator, to visit even the person's chief of staff, or to go to a county commissioner and say this is a problem, that you will be successful. Most successful efforts that I can think of came because an individual was concerned and found others who were concerned. And it can be a small group, an ad hoc group that does the research, gets legislation from other places and says, this is what we need in New Jersey, or it's being part of a group and then participating in ways that are stopping envelopes for a mailing. Or I know with, say, AARP at the local level, that you will come and then finally end up at the State House. I think one of the big success stories of this kind is at the League of Women Voters. If I could just give a little story here. The League was very active 2 years ago in raising questions that we'll look at with the redistricting, called Fair Vote, and did a lot of work going around to all the leagues and getting them to understand what the issue was. But to actually get that issue on the table meant going into the legislature and finding members of the legislature to introduce legislation. And that could really only be done with a certain small group, very strategically finding the right places to go, and then finding other groups with a similar mission. And it was a time when New Jersey came very close to having a constitutional amendment that would have been that would have made redistricting even worse than it is. And that group then was able to get together and have alliances within the legislature so that there were people that they had worked with closely were going to vote no, but they couldn't just do it on their own. So what was needed was an AARP kind of organization. Is he called everybody out? Maybe there are people here in the room, in the virtual out there, who actually showed up at the State House and in front of the State House did something that the League doesn't very often do, and had other people join in and showed a lot of support and a lot of letters pouring in. And that vote never happened. And we never did vote on that proposed constitutional amendment. So it can take many different forms. Another example of how you need people to work with you is no smoking in restaurants, believe it or not. And this comes out of my husband's experience and working with a few members of the League of Women Voters that cared about the health of people with smoking in restaurants. And they drew up a piece of legislation that they wanted to introduce into the New Jersey legislature, and it failed. And in fact, it failed so that it wasn't legal to have a local government have it apply only at the local level. So there was a lot of talk about, well, what would happen if you did it? So there were a couple of league members and some others, health commission people, who went to my husband, who was then the mayor, and said, we're not allowed to do this according to the state, but we think we should test it. And would you introduce an ordinance of not permitting smoking in restaurants in Princeton and see what would happen? And he said, okay, and they did. And so for about a year, Princeton worked on how you implement not smoking in restaurants, but there were so many other towns that noticed and believed that it was a good thing to do that it finally turned out that the state did change and said you couldn't smoke in restaurants. And I think it's a very good example of often you think you can't be successful at the local level or just a few people taking the initiative, but it can happen, but it never happens really that I have ever seen without a dedicated eye and a very collaborative group to make something happen. So if you're thinking, I want to do something, immediately start thinking about who the alliance can be with. And then you can go to the legislature, you can find out what committee, you can go to your legislator, and this is where the connections are very important. Just because your legislator doesn't sit on the committee, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't see that person, explain the reasons for what you want to do, and get that person to be helpful to you, to make the phone call to the right committee chair, to talk to the right staff member. You should go to your local government, even though it has nothing to do with local government in some cases, and ask the local government, your local representative, who do they know who can help you? Which is the best county commissioner to go to if you want something done? So it's this, if you made a diagram, it would be a lot of different avenues that you would be covering, and basically keep in mind that people like to be asked for advice. Not telling them what to do, but to ask them to help you do something is a very effective way of starting the journey or even completing the journey. So I was very pleased that people were asking about how I can do something, how I can run for office, how can I influence the legislature, and take that as the challenge. So I would like to now answer a couple of questions and go to the budget, because there were 3 questions that came in. What's the budget process like? What's the calendar? This is very, very timely. And where do we find out how tax dollars are allocated? And then what are the powers of the school boards? So can we put up my funny little pie charts there? Okay. So what you need to know is, first of all, the state has an annual budget. And in the next week, the governor is going to be giving a budget message which outlines what he thinks government needs and how, and very often they don't talk too much about where they're going to get the money for it. But at the end of the process, which comes in June, because the budget has to be adopted by July, the budget actually has to be introduced from the assembly. So the governor puts the budget together that he or she wants, and then it goes to the pieces of the budget, and there are hundreds of pieces to the budget, to various committees, and committee hearings are held. And then at the final process, and it's usually the last week in June, the legislature tries to come up with a budget that the governor will sign. And so there's last minute negotiation. But what are they negotiating about? Basically, these two circles, the green one is the money that comes into the state, the taxes that you pay. And the purple one is how that money is allocated. And to be simplistic, but this is actually the way it works. If you look at this chart, what do you think is what would you, if you're thinking about this, the largest section, the biggest chunk, the half of the pie is the money that comes in from income taxes. And that's not quite 50%. We're looking at a chart that I did 2 years ago when we had a budget of 38 billion. It looks like it might be up at 40 billion or 39 something. And this year will be very different, we think, because of COVID for a number of reasons, more expenses, maybe less income. But the next largest piece of the pie, if you look over sort of on the lower left, is, or the upper left, is the sales tax, which is about 30 to 35% of the revenue that comes in. Then there's a significant amount of money that comes in different ways from the federal government, from lots of fees, and so that it becomes about a quarter of the budget. And then finally, the smallest piece is the corporate tax. So basically in New Jersey, the income tax supports about half of the budget. So we're looking at about 15 billion coming in. Just today in the paper, the sales tax had been above the estimate for this time of the year, half of the year of the budget. So more people went shopping, I guess, in the holidays, and people bought cars for gifts, as the ads on the television wanted you to do. So what do we do with this money? Well, since we have a broad-based tax, the income tax, it came rather late in our history. It wasn't until about 1975 in the Byrne administration that we finally had a vote that approved a relatively stable form of state tax. Now look over at the purple side. You see something that looks very similar in the size of the segments. And practically all of the $15 billion that I think it will be this year will be going out for school aid, because when the state income tax was passed, the reason that was given is that it would lower property taxes. And because it would be all given back to local government for school aid, which was a very big problem in New Jersey. And the other piece that you see at the lower left is also money that simply goes out for grants and health and family support. Medicaid is a very big item in the budget because it has to be matched to federal support for Medicaid. And so, as you can see, there's very little left for paying for the state's expenses, which is that piece of pie at the top. And it's only about 7 billion, 8 billion, 21% of the revenues. So that New Jersey, when you think of New Jersey, and that covers running prisons, which are now in trouble, The money that would have come in for marijuana was estimated to come in for marijuana would have been a different kind of tax, a different source of revenue, and it would have made it possible to spend money on that we didn't have on problems that we needed to solve. And then, of course, New Jersey has debt, and we have to pay back at least the debt, if not the base of the loan. And so when you look at what you want the state to do, then there's not very much money, given the bargain that we struck when we instituted the income tax. Now, you're probably saying, well, what about the gasoline tax? Well, look down at the corner. You will see there's a $35 billion debt that we have incurred, and that includes dedicated funds. And so the gas tax is a dedicated fund that then goes out to support the repair and building of the roads, and is not part of the purple and green section here. And then you say, well, what about the property tax? Well, that green and purple does not include the property tax. That's a separate bucket. If you added up all of the property taxes that are collected, probably this year we'll be close to, my guess is that it will be more than 28 billion. And if you look at how that gets distributed, it is, of course, as you know, collected by the municipality. And even though there are rules for how you assess value and how you apply that in order to come up with the amount that is actually in our property tax bill, but roughly speaking, 50% goes to the schools immediately. It's as though the schools handed the municipality a bill, and then the other part of that is the county handing the municipality a bill, and the municipality then looks and says, well, this is what we have left. This is what it costs to run the municipality. But basically it starts at the municipal level, the property tax, and then it is given out to other levels. I think the hardest one to really get a good understanding of how the money is used and whether there are ways that you could be saving or changing or so on is at the county level. There's not very much information available. New Jersey was a very conservative state at the time of the Depression, and set up a lot of safeguards, which today are the kinds of rules and regulations that municipalities have to follow in order to have a reserve for uncollected taxes, and the form for the budget has been simplified, but it's still very hard to get information about how the money is spent. On the other hand, what I've shown you in the green and the purple, there is a publication that the Treasury Department puts out called The Budget in Brief, and it's online. It's not the easiest thing to get through. For example, nowadays, I think we're all used to looking at something that's posted online, and if the chapters are laid out, if you click on the chapter that takes you to the chapter, well, the Budget in Brief is not that easy to do. But basically, you can find out a lot because every single department's budget is in there. So you could figure out what the Department of Education is spending its money on. And in most cases, there's a comparison with the year before. So if you think that you can't get information, that's a place where you can get information, and it's just not as easy to find, but it's there if you're patient. And if you were picked up the book, it's very heavy. The other part of this is that the hearings on building the budget in the legislature, very often the legislators sit there and will listen, you don't get very much feedback about what they're thinking and how they will approach the budget. But I think it's one of the more open processes in New Jersey. Now you might sort of say, well, why is this? One of the big factors is, and this was a study that was done in 2016, when it seemed as though the property taxes would just keep going up. And I think that that's really what the case will be. And I'll tell you why, is this research showed that if you went back to the 60s, when actually before we actually had the income tax, the broad-based tax, property taxes were paid in probably equal amount, between half of it coming from residential properties and half of it coming from businesses. We had industry, we had big automobile assembly up in Edison and places like that, that so much more of the property tax was paid by businesses that were huge, were in billions of dollars of goods and services that came out of it. Railroads paid into the property taxes. They were charged, and this was controlled by the county. But today, 90%, close to 90% of property taxes come from residents. Very little comes from these large industrial and commercial properties. So it's not as though property taxes in total have gone up. It's who bears the responsibility for generating the tax itself, the money for it. And over the years, it's been one of the impacts of a changing economy. And we haven't quite figured out how to change that. The assessed valuation of offices is not the same as we had gotten from business and industry. So that's a picture of New Jersey's financial situation. It probably is not very comforting to anyone, and I think this year's budget is going to be even more difficult. And we are borrowing more. As you know, the governor borrowed $4 billion to support fighting COVID, and supposedly we are supposed to be voting to approve any borrowing. And if you look at my little chart, the top layer is very thin of that amount. Maybe what would that be? Maybe not even 8%, $8 billion was approved by the voters. The other comes through appropriation, and then the third is dedicated taxes, like the transportation tax, that makes it possible to borrow money to do the projects, which is then paid back with the taxes that are collected at the gas station. So that is the picture in New Jersey. You might not be happy with it, but that's what it is. So one brief comment about redistricting. Let's put that chart up, and then the people who are managing this, do you have any questions that people would like to throw into the mix?
Nobody has entered questions yet. New questions on the chat have not been entered. So I think
Aren't they polite? Wow.
I think you can just keep going with what you've got on your plate.
All right. Okay. Well, here's redistricting. Let's go back to that first section of the Constitution. And the founders really wanted to make sure that it was fair. And they delegated the counting of people, not voters, in the states, and said, you have to create districts that are equal in number of people, but we will tell you how many districts you get, because we are having a Congress of 405, I think, districts. I should have checked that. So that was turned over to the states. And basically, then the state would have to say to itself, well, how do we do this? We now have gotten the census figures and we have 1,000 people and we have 10 seats. How are we going to divide these people up into these 10 districts? And we know we have to have an even number. And by the way, that fact has been litigated, and the Supreme Court had to reinforce the fact that it had to be equal, even though there was a lot of not conformance, let's put it that way. So basically, the first time this job was given to the legislature, because the legislature, the state legislature, and that was something that the states took care of. It was not what the U.S. Constitution specified. So of course the legislature would be a logical place to put it. But of course the legislature, as we said in the very early part of this, the parties are very important. If you were the party in power and you had this job, it was so very tempting to make the decisions about the districts and what should be included in which district, because it is a subjective matter that still to this day, in about 35 of the states, the legislature and the legislature in power gets to make up the districts. And that's why you're hearing a lot about redistricting now, because most of those 35 states, if you're a Republican, you might think it's a great idea that the Republicans could make up the legislative districts. If you're a Democrat, you'd be suspicious about it. But it's been the other way in other years, and so it's just a fact of politics. But in New Jersey, that's the way it was done, and there wasn't too much attention paid to it. But what happened was that in New Jersey, like in a lot of places, the legislature was formed by giving every county one senator. And the way there was some distribution done for respect for an equal number of people was that smaller counties were given one member of the assembly, and other counties were given 2 or 3. But it was in the 60s that the whole issue of equal one man, one vote, one person, one vote came up. And both in the New Jersey legislature and at the national legislature, it was strictly enforced that you couldn't use geographic boundaries. You had to use districts that were created so that each person in effect had the same weight in voting. Well, that came up, you know, the big day that we should all celebrate is the day in 1947. Let's see, when would we do that? We would do that in another, 5 years, 6 years, that we should celebrate the New Jersey Constitution, because that's when we got a strong governor, a CEO type person, because up until that time, we had a weak governor who could only run for 1 3-year term, with the legislature really being the most powerful institution. And when the new Constitution was being formed and created a very fine justice administration that was taken really out of the counties where it had been, the legislature said, we're not coming to, this is shorthand, we're not coming to the Constitutional Convention if you're going to deal with how you have representatives chosen for the Senate and the Assembly. But then we had these decisions made, and in 1965, New Jersey had a special Constitution Convention where they said, okay, we're not going to have one person per county. If you think of the county party, the county boss in Atlantic City representing, say, 100 people, and the county boss in Hudson County representing 1,000 people, you could see what a variance that was. It was a huge variance. So we, in New Jersey, suddenly overnight became a reform state, not doing it in the legislature, but having a legislative redistricting commission. And if you look down the side, you had to decide who would be in the commission, how would they be appointed, who would be the chair, and what would you do about public engagement? Those are the 4 things that you'd have to decide if you're going to do it differently. Well, what happened is that New Jersey took it out of the legislature, but it's very closely tied, except that the parties, this is very unusual, have equal weight. So you have the state party chair appointing the 5 Democrats or the Republicans and 5 Republicans. And with no specification of what the qualities or the experience of those members should be. And there was no chair designated, but they anticipated that this 10-member bifurcated body would not be able to reach an agreement. So once they met and their dates when they had to meet, as soon as the census data came out, so we know how many people you had to put into districts, they could say they can't decide, and the Chief Justice would appoint somebody to basically break the deadlock. Well, that's not a very good way to run a committee. I mean, can you imagine having a committee where people meet and all they do is decide they can't agree, and then you send somebody in to break the deadlock? But that's what we've been doing, and so far that hasn't changed. And under this system, there is no public engagement. In other words, we have open public meetings. We have to have legislation, even though it's not perfect, be open for comment. This is totally closed to the public, and the plan is put out, and there's no draft plan, there's no discussing it. So that's what the legislature did. In 1973, they actually finally worked this out and have had, this will be the 4th time that we'll be doing this because we only do it every 4 years. And this year, because the census is so delayed, a constitutional amendment was introduced and passed that said because the information to create the new districts would be so late, the people who are in the legislature now would just simply continue, and they'd have to run for office again. It wouldn't be that they just could continue, but basically it's the status quo, and that the redistricting committee would be meeting whenever the data came along. And it's probably not going to put out its new districts very, very soon. So that went along, and nobody was watching what was going on with Congress because New Jersey had had many years of not having a change in the districts. So if we were allocated 13 districts because of our population, then you didn't have to worry about changing them if we had more districts or fewer districts. But in 1995, they created a commission to do the Congress work. And this is where I think it becomes interesting. In this case, they decided they would have 12 members, 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans, but not any one person would be selecting the members. That would be so that it's still in the legislature's hands and the party chair's hands, but you would have the Senate president and the minority leader each picking one, and so on. And the members would be selecting a chair that would begin the process with them and would make that recommendation to the Supreme Court to pick the best chair from the ones that were nominated. And they were required to have public meetings and to have a public meeting to present the plan. These have not been really engaging public meetings. They could do a much better job, but at least it wasn't a totally closed session. So now in my handwriting that you can't possibly read, that is the reform that is going on in many different places. And here in New Jersey, it's very actively going on. And you have the League of Women Voters taking another leadership role after defeating the bad constitutional amendment, never even coming to the voters, which would say, what would be a better way of doing this? And we have about 7 or 9 states that have done a much better job of including people on the commission who were considered good public servants and mainly appointed by judges. In California, they're actually elected, and people can nominate themselves, and that the commission would have to have a supermajority, so that if you added 3 public members, then you would have to have a vote of 8-5 or 7-6 in order to adopt the plan. And finally, there are much more defined open public meetings, working meetings, putting out data that the commission is dealing with. And so it's highly doubtful that any of this will be enacted in time for the redistricting that will be taking place very soon. But I think everybody should pay attention to what's happening in other states and in New Jersey, just to advocate for something that is very important, but turns out to be very political. So with that, I'm going to stop.
So excuse me, Ingrid, and thank you so very much. I know we've just hit the 1 hour mark, and I'm sure you must be quite weary. We did have quite a bit.
No, I love it. I'm sorry that I don't see all of you and see if you're looking at me with a quizzical look or shaking your head. So, and still awake and not asleep, but.
So we did have quite a bit of interest and chat about the redistricting question. And I guess we should tell people about the Fair Districts New Jersey website, which the League is a partner on a coalition.
Yeah, and if you just go on League of Women Voters, LWVNJ, you will find they still have stuff up on the front part, the top part of the site about the election. Just keep going down and you'll get to a band that says fair voting. And that's a very good statement. And then there are other people in New Jersey who are working on other arrangements. And New Jersey has had quite a bit of attention because of a professor at Princeton, Sam Wong, who has been working on, I didn't mention the bad word of gerrymandering. It's really gerrymandering because it's named after Elbridge Gerry, who was one of the people who worked with New Jersey to get a representative government straightened out in a way that actually included citizen voters, who then went on to become governor of Massachusetts. And at that point started to try to influence the legislature to draw the districts to help him continue being governor. And so that district, and there's some in New Jersey that looked like a salamander, sort of with a tail and a funny head and bent around. And that's how we got the word gerrymandering. And gerrymandering means setting up the districts so that there are, in effect, more Republicans than Democrats, which is now the criticism of the legislatures that are in Republican hands, in ways that the legislature, the body of the legislature, doesn't really reflect the interests of the voters if you looked at the parties as having agendas and fairness. So the League is trying to guide a process that would make for a fairer vote.
We did have one last clarification request about your budget discussion, but then we will certainly let you go. But we do have somebody who, after you finished your budget presentation, asked the difficult question, where does pension liability fit into New Jersey's budget?
It's in that little piece of sliver of a on the purple, it's the debt sliver, which at that point was $3 billion, but that's just paying into the agreed upon payment that the state would make every year, that started in the Christie administration. But last year, I believe it was not paid. So we are continuing to pile up that that debt, but that's the in effect the interest payment on that debt.
Thank you. So I know that in addition, people are asking about seeing your charts, and we have them all, and we will be able to post a link to a recording of this session and links to your charts on our own website, League of Women Voters website. I know that you wanted to mention the League's New Jersey.
Oh yeah, I think I mentioned the budget in brief. The other website that is very helpful on the whole business of the legislature and committees and all of that, the Office of Legislative Services in New Jersey has a very good website. You have to study it because there's so much detail on it, but you really can find out if a bill that you're interested in is being heard today by going on that site, as well as getting biographies of the legislators. But the League book, the Citizens Guide, is incredibly helpful, and it has addresses. And if you want to know if your town, what district it's in, if you keep forgetting the numbers, is it 16 or 17 or something, is very good. And the Office of Legislative Services site I would recommend it if you're into trying to figure out what's going on. What is the schedule for that day? What hearings are up, and so on. I give them a lot of credit, as well as basic information about how things work. The budget in brief is up on the website, nj.gov. And then the final place where you really want to know what's happening in New Jersey government is NJ Spotlight News. I feel very proud to have been a founder, but it is journalism driven. It's not a site where they pick articles from different places. This is all done by journalists that have beats of finances, energy and environment, health. They do very good data charts that you can look up, for example, the state of New Jersey, where all the nursing homes are and how they're rated. It is now a formal part of NJTV, but it is a website that that you can go to and get their daily newspaper, in effect, or you can for free. And you can get the weekend roundup, so that you find out what are the key things that happened during the week. But I want to emphasize the fact that this is not curated. It doesn't come from anywhere else. This is a staff of journalists that covers New Jersey, and I'm very proud to have been a part of it. And now I still play a role because I chair the Citizens Advisory Board of NJTV, and would love to hear from anybody about what you think of New Jersey TV. But I'm very pleased that Spotlight is now being made available to all of New Jersey, and it's really, I think, the best way to keep up to date on New Jersey. It's the only place I know of where in an election you can find information about every single district and who's running in it, which is hard information to find. So thank you for letting me give you that
Well,
ad.
thank you so very much for this amazingly comprehensive scan of our, if I may say, crazy state. It's just been wonderful to have you as our guest, and I hope lots of other leagues in our state will know that you're ready and willing to Zoom without having to travel. So thank you so very much, Ingrid, and thank you, Beth Morgan.
Let me end where I began, and to say, I think that's a wonderful question. What is the value of my vote? We should all think about that.
We certainly shall. We certainly shall. So thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Beth Morgan, our technician. Thank you, Marcia Steinberg. And thank you, Kate Schumacher, for being our backup everything. And it's really been a wonderful evening. So thank you so much. And good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.